are doing the FVAC form, the for your protection, get a home inspection, and then contingency removal. So in let's add that in there. Hold on just a second. Forms. We're going to come down here. Give me just a second. Because I kind of like you to know where this all comes from. So in the residential purchase agreement, hold on, it's adding that to my forms. So I'm already in the forms editor in case you're new to the office or whatnot. You can access this. You go to car.org, which is the California Association of Realtors. Then go to transactions, and then go to Zip Forms or Lone Wolf powered by Zip Forms. It'll prompt you to log in if you're not already logged in. And then it will, it's moving this around. It's really irritating me. Sorry. And then it will open up your car forms library. So that's where we're at right now, is inside the car forms library. I've got the editor opened up, the new editor, which I think is your only option at this point, or they're eliminating the other one here shortly, allows you to open up multiple forms at the same time for editing. So I'm going to scroll down to the residential purchase agreement so you can see where these forms are referenced that we're covering today, at least the first two. Here's the first page of the actual purchase agreement. It's actually page 8 of the packet, but in the grid on the section where it talks about financing, it's going to ask you right here on 3. So this is section 3E1. What kind of loan amount it is, or what kind of loan it is. It said loan amount, but what kind of loan it is. And if you check the box for FHA, notice here it says FEVAC/HID of attached. Or if you check the box for VA, for a VA offer, it's also FVAC attached. So that's where these two forms come from, is right here in this box. We should be utilizing them if you have FHA or VA buyers. So the FHA VA amendatory clause is that first one. That's the FVAC form. It's an addendum to the purchase agreement or other. It's always, it should always be addendum to the purchase agreement. It could be an addendum to the counter offer though. So if you forgot it with your offer, then somebody countered or whatnot, it could be a counter offer, or maybe it wasn't included as part of the purchase agreement. You've got a fully executed purchase agreement. It could be to like an AEA that the FVAC to be included. Or if you switched financing, it could be part of the AEA. So just know that this would be included, and that's where you would use the other form. You're going to put the date in the upper left-hand corner of the purchase agreement, page 1 of the purchase agreement, or whatever form it is that you're referencing. The property address is going to go there, buyer's names, and then seller's names. Buyer and seller are referred to as parties. As always, if you have questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and interrupt me, or throw it in the chat box. I have that opened, or you can raise your hand. I'll see that as well. It is expressly, number 1, it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions of this contract, the purchaser shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein or incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposits or otherwise, unless the purchaser has been given, in accordance with the HUD/FHA or VA requirements, a written statement by the Federal Housing Commissioner, Department of Veterans Affairs, or a direct endorsement lender setting forth the appraised value of the property of not less than, and this is where you put in the purchase price. The lender is going to want a copy of this, and they're going to require the purchase price. So we had a workaround previously, which I'll tell you why you need a workaround here in a minute. But we had a workaround where you could, like if you're doing an appraisal guarantee, you could put in a less here, but the lender requires the actual purchase price to go here, not an appraisal gap amount. Okay, so you're going to have to fill in the purchase price. It would be nice if this just fed over from the RPA, but it doesn't. The purchaser shall have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of the contract without regard to the amount of the appraised valuation. The appraisal valuation is arrived at to determine the maximum mortgage the Department of Housing and Urban Development will insure or the Department of Veteran Affairs will guarantee. Neither HUD or FHA warrant the value or the condition of the property. The purchaser should satisfy himself or herself that the price and the condition of the property are acceptable. So that's just saying that, hey, the buyer doesn't have to move forward with this purchase if it doesn't appraise at the value. And if it doesn't appraise at the value, the buyer can still choose to move forward. So that's what paragraph 1 is stating. If after signing this amendatory clause, the purchase price increases, buyer and seller agree to sign before close of escrow a new mandatory clause that reflects the final purchase price agreed by buyer and seller. So if there's a counter offer or whatever in there, a new one would be signed. For FHA transactions, the amendatory clause is not required on HUD REO sales. So that would be a foreclosed HUD property. This form's not required. Sales where the seller is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or the Department of Veteran Affairs, Rural Housing Service, or other federal, state, or local government agencies, mortgagees disposing of REO assets, or sellers at foreclosure sales, and those sales for which the borrower will not be an owner-occupant, sales to non-profit agencies. Okay, so it's just if it's a bank-owned property, this form's not required. Certification. The undersigned buyer, seller, and real estate agents or brokers hereby certify the terms and conditions of the sales contract referenced above are to the true and best of their knowledge and belief, and the other agreement entered into by any parties in connection with real estate transaction is part of or attached to the sales agreement. Warning, it is a crime to knowingly make false statements to the United States on this or any other similar form. Penalties can include fine, imprisonment, or both, because FHA and VA are government-owned entities, okay? So that's this form. Why is this form important? Well, number one, it says it's going to be required if you have an FHA or VA deal. But let's dig a little further into the purchase agreement so that you guys understand the importance of this form, because it is important, even if you have listings. So remember here on E1, it stated that, hey, if we had a FHA or a VA, that this form would be attached. So if we go over here to the paragraph reference in the second column of the grid, it says that we can find more information about this on section 5C1. Okay, so we're going to scroll down to 5C1. We're going to check one thing as I scroll past it. Okay, we're not going to go to 5C1. We're going to scroll down here to 3L2 in the grid where it talks about the appraisal. Okay, here's where this comes into play. Removal of the appraisal contingency does not eliminate the appraisal cancellation rights in the FVAC. So if I have an FHA or a VA buyer and I check this box for no appraisal contingency, they still have the rights for cancellation under the FVAC. So they are in fact bluffing on removing that appraisal contingency. This is why it's so important. Okay, to work around this, I have previously submitted offers under additional finance terms that the buyers waive their rights under the FVAC addendum. Lenders don't like that, but I've done it before. And then we just, after the appraisal comes in and everything, we do another amendment to the existing agreement to remove that so that the lender's satisfied. But that is one workaround. So if you have a listing and you're accepting an FHA or a VA buyer and they mark the box no appraisal contingency, they do in fact still have an appraisal contingency. And if you have a buyer and you're submitting an offer that's an FHA or a VA and you check the box for no appraisal contingency, they still have their rights under the FVAC. I would not recommend it as a buyer to check that box with the intention to bluff a listing agent, because you're not going to make friends doing that. And you just need to be aware that that's the case. Does anybody have questions about that FVAC form or how that comes into play in conjunction with the residential purchase agreement? Okay. So important form, purchase price goes here. Oh, yep.
What did you say you've done before that the lenders don't like? Was it mark that box or something else?
Yeah, so on the purchase agreement, under other finance terms, I put buyers waive their rights under the FVAC addendum or FVAC form would technically be the right way to do it. Lenders don't like that, but I've done it in order to remove the appraisal contingency. Yes, Anastasia?
So what if you have So I had one and the appraisal came in under.
Yeah, so
And we
anytime you
had
have
that same
FHA,
thing.
sorry, go ahead.
And we had the FHA amendatory clause.
Yeah, so anytime you have the FHA, VA, or conventional buyer, and you have an appraisal contingency in place, or for FHA or VA, you have the amendatory clause in place, which is in place for any FHA or VA buyer, period, end of story, unless they waive it. You can choose to cancel the contract. You can renegotiate the price based on the appraised value. Those are your options. The seller can dispute the appraised value as well. So the seller has the right to dispute it. Now, keep in mind that if it's a VA buyer and the appraisal is going to come in low, the appraiser is supposed to issue what's called a notice of tidewater, which means they issue this notice to the lender, and the lender is supposed to make all the agents, all the parties in the transaction aware that the appraiser has issued notice of tidewater, which means they're having problems getting the value of the property to get to the purchase price, which allows the agents to be able to submit comps to the appraiser before that appraisal is issued. But you would have the right, if it doesn't appraise, you have the right under the FVAC to renegotiate, to work to renegotiate the price with the seller. The seller doesn't have to agree to it. They can either agree to it, meet some middle ground, or say, no, I'm not changing the price. And then the buyer has the right to either move forward or cancel based on those negotiations. With an FHA or a VA appraisal, that appraisal stays with the property, which means that if I've got a listing and the appraisal, I had an FHA buyer and the appraisal comes in low, and I decide I don't want to renegotiate that contract, I cannot move forward with another FHA buyer without having a discussion with the agent, the buyer's agent ahead of time, saying, hey, the appraisal came in $10,000 below what we're asking. My sellers want asking price. Your buyers are going to have to come in with the difference, because they're going to pull that same appraisal for that next deal, that next buyer, if it is an FHA or VA. Now, if it's an FHA appraisal, VA is not going to pull a copy of the FHA appraisal, or if it's a VA appraisal, the FHA is not going to pull a copy of that VA appraisal. I think I said that right. It sounds funny to me in my head, but FHA sticks with FHA, VA sticks with VA. Conventional always get a new appraisal. Okay. And just so you know too, if we scroll back up here to that purchase agreement, let's see here. I don't think it's in the appraisal section. I think it's in the investigation of property. Buyer's review. I just want to point this out so you guys have all this information. Let's see here. Seller, condition, occupancy. Hold on. We're going to go paragraph 12, I think. 8, 10, 12. Buyer's investigation of property. I think it's going to be in this paragraph. I will find it. Let's see. Inspection, let's see, it's limited to. Oh, it's somewhere.
You don't know this form by heart with
I don't, this little clause. Oh, here we go. It is here. See, I knew it was here. In 12D, how dare you, Anastasia? In 12D, it says 12D3, by the time specified in paragraph 3L3 or 3 days after receipt of any investigation report, whichever is latter, Give seller at no cost complete copies of all such reports obtained by buyer. It's talking about your inspection reports that the buyer has done on the property. The seller gets a copy of any of those. Which obligations will survive the termination of this agreement. So even if the buyers decide to cancel based on the inspection, sellers get copies of all those inspections because now those have become material disclosures. This delivery of investigation reports shall not include any appraisal except an appraisal received in connection with an FHA or a VA loan. So if it's a conventional appraisal, the seller does not have a right to receive that from the buyer. But if your buyer is an FHA or VA, seller gets a copy of that appraisal because that appraisal becomes material facts relating to the property in the case that the seller decides to cancel on that buyer and move forward with another FHA or VA buyer. It goes with the property. So just so you know, that's in there. 12E3 outlines, or sorry, 12D3 outlines what's required to be provided by the buyer, including that appraisal. So if you ever have a listing and it's a VA or an FHA buyer and you want a copy of that appraisal, this is where you reference to get a copy of it. I like copies of the appraisals because I like to see how appraisers handle the comps. I just think it's fascinating. So I like to look at the grid of appraisals, even on my listings. So this is how I get a copy of those if it's a VA or an FHA buyer. Okay, any questions about that FVAC? All right, moving right along, the other form that is referenced in that grid about the FHA buyers, it talks about the FVAC form or the HID form, which is for your protection, get a home inspection. This form is required for all FHA transactions. I would probably recommend that you include this for all of your buyers. In addition to the buyer's inspection waiver form, I would also include this for all of my transactions because it outlines the importance of a home inspection, which we should be encouraging all of our buyers to get. Why you need a home inspection. Buying a home is probably the biggest investment you will ever make. The purpose of a home inspection is to inform and educate you about the property before you make a financial commitment. Deborah, did you have a question?
I do. What was the name for that? What's the acronym for that form?
HID.
HID.
HID. I think it's because it used to be called maybe home inspection disclosure. Yes, Adriana.
Would you send us out with the purchase agreement or with the buyer rep agreement?
You could do either or. If it's a VA or an FHA buyer, I would do it probably with the offer just because it probably needs to be dated. It really doesn't matter ultimately. But you could do it with the BRBC, the buyer representation and broker compensation, so that they know upfront that you're recommending that home inspection. Either way.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. A home inspection will give you a more detailed information about the overall condition of the house you want to buy. See, so far, not scary, just like here's what a home inspection does. A home inspection will occur if you arrange for one. Will only occur if you arrange for one. FHA does not perform home inspections. For a fee, a qualified inspector will take an unbiased look at your potential new home to evaluate its physical condition, estimate the remaining useful life of the major systems, equipment, structure, and finishes, and identify any items that need to be repaired or replaced. If you request an inspection early in the process, you may be able to make your purchase contract contingent on its results, right? It's talking about there the inspection contingency there that's going to be in your contract. What's included in the inspection? To better understand what to expect in the home inspection, ask the prospective inspector for their standards of practice for a sample home inspection. How to find an inspector. To find a qualified home inspector, ask for references from friends, real estate professionals, local licensing authorities, and organizations that qualify and test home inspectors. Appraisals are not home inspections. An appraisal is required to estimate the home's value for your lender and does not replace a home inspection. FHA does not guarantee the value or condition of your new home. If you find problems with your home after closing, FHA cannot give or lend you money for repairs, and the FHA cannot buy the home back from you. Radon gas and other health and safety issues. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Surgeon General recommend that all houses be tested for radon. For more information, call the toll-free National Radon Information Line. Ask your inspector if additional health and safety tests are relevant to your home, such as mold, air or water quality, presence of asbestos, lead paint, or formaldehyde insulation or pest inspections. I or we acknowledge a receipt of this for your protection. Get a home inspection. Okay, this is required for FHA buyers. It is not required for anybody else. I think it's a good practice to include it. Any questions about for your protection, get a home inspection? It's a pretty simple, straightforward form. There's nothing secretive or scary about it, but that is required. Okay. If you check the box on your RPA, just so you know, it generally will automatically add the form to your transaction. You do have to select it to edit it and fill it out and make sure it's done appropriately, but it will automatically add it like it does other forms. The other form that I had planned to cover today is the buyer or the contingency removal form. So there's two contingency removal forms. One is a buyer contingency removal and one is the seller contingency removal. They split those apart back in June. So the buyer contingency removal form, in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement, or it might reference a request for repair or a response and reply to the request for repair or other forms. So for the most part, it's going to reference the purchase agreement or the repair request. Now, keep in mind too, side note, that if you submit a request for repairs to a seller, it has on that request for repairs and the seller response that the seller response is contingent, is assuming that the buyer's removing their inspection contingency, their physical inspection contingency. So keep that in mind. You don't need a separate contingency removal for the physical inspection if the seller has agreed to the buyer's repairs, or if the buyer agrees to the seller's response to the repairs. I'll cover those both here in a minute as well. I'll pull those up. But keep that in mind. It is on the new forms. Here's where you're going to put that. Again, you're going to put that date. If you're referencing the purchase agreement, it's the printed date in the upper left-hand corner, the first page of the purchase agreement. For any other form that doesn't have a printed date in the upper right or left-hand corner of the form, it's the date at which it was signed by the party. Okay. You're going to put the property address in there, buyer's names, seller's names. And then these are all of your options. The buyers and sellers are referred to as parties. Buyer removal of buyer contingencies. With respect to any contingency and cancellation right that the buyer removes unless otherwise agreed to in a separate written agreement between the buyer and seller, buyer shall conclusively have deemed to have completed all buyer investigations and review of reports and other applicable information and disclosures. Elected to proceed with the transaction and assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense, if any, for repairs, corrections, or the inability to obtain financing. Waiver of statutory disclosures is prohibited by law. Your statutory disclosures are your TDS and your SPQ or your exempt seller disclosure. Also your natural hazard, that one falls underneath the statutory disclosures. Same with the earthquake hazards if it was built before 1965, and your lead-based paint if it was built before 1978. And then it also doesn't, statutory disclosures also, your avid kind of falls underneath those. It's a little different, but same idea. Buyer removes only the following individually checked buyer contingencies. The paragraph numbers refer to the CAR form RPA, so your residential purchase agreement. Applicable paragraph numbers may be different for different forms. So you have your loan, your appraisal, the investigation. So right, that's A and B is loan or appraisal. Those two are pretty straightforward. The next one is a little tricky because it's C is the investigation of the property. It could be the entire investigation contingency. It could be only the part, section 2, C2 is only the part of the investigation contingency related to the inspections concerning physical attributes to the property. That would just be the physical inspection. All buyer investigations, including insurability other than physical attributes. If you're like, Amy, what does this all mean? Don't worry, we'll go back and reference it here in a minute. The entire buyer's investigation contingency except blank And so it's got to fill in there, or you could check a box. So it could be fire insurance, flood insurance, or other. Okay, so insurability is really hard right now. So you might be removing everything except like we're still trying to secure insurance. So that would be homeowners insurance is fire insurance. Okay, if it falls in a flood zone, then it would be flood, or it could be fire and flood. If you were uncomfortable with that, you could check the box here for like homeowners insurance or landlord insurance if it was going to be a non-owner occupied property and they're still trying to obtain finance or insurability. Okay, so that's your checks. Your under C is investigation. Like I said, we'll go back and I'll show you. Well, let's go back before we move on to, yes.
Really quick. So is the home insurance part of the contingency automatically, or?
Yeah, so your homeowner's insurance, your insurability is part of the inspection contingency automatically. Yep.
Okay.
All right. So here on the grid of the RPA, so I've bounced back up to the RPA, the grid section 3L is all the contingencies that are listed. So this is what's going to be on your contingency removal. So here under L3, 8C, and 12 is your investigation of the property. That's the contingency. Keep in mind the informal access is not a contingency of the property. So this just specifies how many days the sellers have to allow buyers access to the property. But in the investigation contingency, let's go check out paragraphs 8C and 12, which is referenced in the second column. So we're going to scroll down to 8C. Investigation of property. This agreement is as specified in paragraph 3L3 contingent on the buyer's acceptance of the condition of any matter affecting the property. See paragraph 12. So that one wasn't very descriptive. So we're going to hop down to paragraph 12, 10, 11, 12. Buyer's investigation and matters affecting the property. So this whole section here under section 12 is what's covered under the buyer investigation contingency. Okay. Buyer's investigations include but are not limited to investigations regarding any physical attributes to the properties or items connected to the property, such as a general home inspection, lead-based paint hazards, wood destroying pests and organisms. Okay. Any other specific inspections of the physical condition, land, and improvements. Investigation of any other, I skipped that whole paragraph. I'm not going to explain to you guys what a pest inspection is. Investigation of any other matter affecting the property other than those that are specified as separate contingencies. Buyer's investigations include but are not limited to an investigation of the availability and general cost of homeowners insurance, flood insurance, and fire insurance. See Buyer's Investigation Advisory, BIA. So right here under this section, it's all physical attributes of the property, including insurability, fall underneath that contingency. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, we're going to hop back down to the buyer contingency. So that's why you have so many options under here under C, whether it's the physical inspection, whether it's anything except the physical inspection, whether it's our physical attributes, whether it's insurability. So that all falls underneath this investigation contingency, which is item C. Okay. D is review of seller documents. So, right, the seller is supposed to provide you with disclosures. So that's review of all seller documents, review of all seller documents except government reports, statutory disclosures, or others. Okay, so if there's something missing, we could put that in there. We could do an except. Maybe the sellers provided us with all their documents and disclosures, but the property is located in Davis and they're supposed to have a pre-sale inspection done in the city of Davis. Then we could check that box here and we don't have that yet, that, hey, we're removing our contingency for the review of all the seller documents except the government reports. Or like in Woodland, you're required to have the fire suppression system inspected. Right? Or in the Bay Area, several of those cities, like you have to have a sewer lateral inspection done. Okay. So you have to know the area in which you're buying and what's required. So that would be a government report. Your statutory and other disclosures that fall under paragraph 11 or all review of seller documents. Okay. Now keep in mind that if we remove this contingency, the sellers provided us with all the documents. We've reviewed all the documents. We remove our contingency and then all of a sudden the seller goes, Oh my gosh, I totally forgot. We had an insurance claim 2 years ago for $20,000. The kitchen sink leaked underneath the cabinet. It flooded the floor. We had to have the floors replaced and the cabinets replaced. There was an insurance claim. That is part of the statutory disclosures. That's a material fact affecting the property. If the buyers or the sellers hand deliver that information to you, you have 3 days to review it and you can cancel the agreement, even if that contingency is removed. If they email you that information or send it to electronically, so any way but hand deliver, then you have 5 days to review that information and make a decision of whether you still want to move forward with that property or not. So that revives that seller disclosure contingency, even though you've already removed it. Now, if we go into an offer, the sellers have not yet provided us with documents. We remove all of our contingencies and now the sellers provide us with documents. Sorry, you don't get an extra 5 days. That was your fault for removing that contingency before documents were provided. This is also why it's important to make sure all your seller documents are completed. They should have every line filled out, every question answered. If there's a yes on something, it should have an explanation. That would be fully complete seller disclosures. We don't have to remove this contingency until those are sent to us complete. Okay. E is your preliminary title report. It's a whole separate contingency. F is the common interest, your HOA or your OA disclosure. So if the property falls in an HOA, it falls into that. G is your review of leased and liened items. Okay, not only is it the review of the leased and liened items, but the buyer's ability to assume any of those leased or liened items. Okay, and that falls under, you can go back and reference it here. It talks about which paragraphs in the RPA to reference, but that's not just the review of leased and liened, it's also the buyer being able to assume those leased and liened items or take that on. H is the sale of buyer's property. Keep in mind there's 2 aspects to that. It's both entering into contract and close of escrow. If you checked that box on the sale of buyer's property form, which is the, why can't I remember the acronym for that one right now? Contingency, that's the COP form, the contingency for sale of buyer's property. The COP form, there's 2 parts of that one. It defaults to just the entering into escrow. You have to check the box for close of escrow, or you have to check a box for both now, I think, either one. But just make sure you're careful on what you remove there. There's also I for other. So if you brought in another contingency for something, maybe I can't even think of one right now. But it would fall under I. So you can add contingencies to the contract. So those are your blanket contingencies. All of them are automatically part of the purchase agreement, except for H, which is the sale of the buyer's property, and I, which is the other. All those as default are part of the purchase agreement as individual items. There is an option down here on 3. So section 2 is removes only the following contingency. We can remove them one at a time. The other option down here on 3 is, hey, the buyer's going to remove all the contingencies except the following. So if you want to, you know, a lot of times we remove kind of all these bottom ones, we kind of lump, because in the previous contract, they were all lumped together. The investigation, the review of seller disclosures, the preliminary title report, the leased and liened item, the HOA. Sometimes we lump all those together, remove them all at the same time. I usually instruct my mentees or agents to kind of match the contingency removal on those at all the same time frame. You could come down here and check this. Hey, we're going to remove all. I don't know why it's not letting me check this box today, but we'll just pretend that I can check that box. We're removing all the contingencies. I feel like I must have checked something up here, but I don't see it. So all the contingencies except, so maybe we're removing everything but the loan and the appraisal. There we go. It automatically checked it when I checked one of those boxes down there. That would remove everything but loan and appraisal. Now, keep in mind that if you have that contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, you're also removing not just the finding or entering into contract of the buyer's property, but the close of escrow. So if you haven't closed escrow on there, we don't want to do that one. Okay. You could always specify it down here, close of escrow of buyer's property. Or you might want to just individually check the ones that you want to remove up here. So you can utilize that option as well. So we can remove everything except the loan, everything except the appraisal, everything except the close of, oh, right here, contingency for close of escrow buyer's property. So you might want to check all three of those. Anything but the review of condominium planned development disclosures. Maybe you haven't gotten those yet. So those are your options there under that one. Or if we're ready to remove everything, today's the close of escrow and we probably should remove all of our contingencies. We're going to check that box that, hey, on number 4, buyer hereby removes any and all buyer contingencies. Okay, so those are your options on the buyer contingency form and how they reference and what's included as part of those. Questions about that? Okay, just for kicks, because we're here and we have time, there's still seller contingency removal, but we're going to hop up to paragraph 11 just so you can see what the statutory and other disclosures are as part of the residential purchase agreement. That's going to be in paragraph 11. So if you want to know what falls underneath there, we're going to scroll back up here. And paragraph 11, statutory and other disclosures fall underneath here. The TDS, the NHD, and other statutory or supplemental disclosures. They're included but not limited to the real estate transfer disclosure statement, the natural hazard disclosure statement, or the NHD report. That all falls under the NHD. And then either the CAR form, SPQ, or ESD. That would be the seller property questionnaire or the exempt seller disclosure. If the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity, then you also need to provide that FHDS form, the fire hardening disclosure statement. This talks about when the transfer disclosure statement is required. It also talks about the fact that the agent is supposed to do an agent visual inspection disclosure. And then the SPQ. So those are the statutory disclosures that are required by law to be provided to the buyer. You also have the lead-based paint disclosure. Again, that's if the property was built before 1978. We already talked about the home fire hazard hardening disclosure if it's in a high or very high fire hazard zone. You can't waive the rights to the statutory lead or other disclosures. And keep in mind too that the contingency for the review of the seller disclosures is also the return of those disclosures to the seller signed. Okay, so that falls underneath that. Any questions about that contingency removal form or anything else that we've talked about so far? Okay, our second contingency removal form, so that's the buyer contingency removal form that we've talked about. You may have multiple of these. They're just going to be sequential order. Buyer contingency removal number 1 is going to be, there. The next one will be 2. And then 3, it's not going to be like 1A, 1B. It's not going to be A. It's not going to be inspection. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number them sequentially. The next one is our seller contingency removal. Again, number sequentially 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't get creative. In accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement or the request for repair or the response and reply to the repair request, those are your options, or other. Put the date, address, sellers, and buyers' names. The seller removal of seller contingencies with respect to any contingency and cancellation right that the seller removes unless otherwise agreed to in a separate written agreement between the buyer and the seller shall conclusively be deemed to have completed all actions and investigations related to such a contingency, elected to proceed with the transaction, and assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense, if any, for continuing without a contingency. Waiver of statutory disclosures is prohibited by law. The seller has very few contingencies, and it would only be if they were negotiated in as part of the agreement under the sale of the buyer's, the purchase of replacement property. So it's a SPRP, seller's purchase of replacement property, is the form that would be used. And again, you have the options of finding a replacement property and closing on replacement property. Both those boxes need to be checked on the SPRP for them both to be in effect. Otherwise, it just defaults to the finding of replacement property. I believe you have to check the box for the closing of replacement property, or the seller may check a box and add in on some sort of counter offer, some other random contingency. Keep in mind too, on the SPRP, the seller's purchase of replacement property, it also now includes rentals. So if the seller just wants to ensure that they have a home before we close escrow on their property, that they have a place to go, whether it's purchasing a property or finding a rental property, that's all covered under the SPRP form. Okay. And again, that needs to be included. Usually it's checked as part of the listing agreement and then you would include it. I usually fill out my SPRPs ahead of time if I have a listing where it's contingent on the seller finding a replacement property so that the terms are agreeable to my sellers. So those are really the only contingencies the seller gets. It has to be negotiated in. Otherwise, the only reason a seller can cancel a contract is for the failure of the buyer to perform. A seller can't just decide on day 3 that, you know what, we changed our mind. We don't want to sell our house. Sorry, buyers. Sellers don't have the right to do that. So any questions there on the seller contingency removal? All right. I'm going to show you on the request for repair, just because this is a newer thing. It didn't used to be there. And the seller response and buyer reply to the request for repair, where it removes that investigation contingency so that you can see it on there. Here is the request for repair. This is normally what gets submitted by the seller or the buyer to the seller when they're asking for repairs. You have the buyer's request for repairs up here. You have any reports that are going to be included. And then keep in mind that if there's any required repairs as part of an FHA or a VA transaction, you do that on section 3 because it communicates to the seller that, hey, if you don't do these, the buyer actually can't close on the property. So that's section 3. Section 4 right here is if the seller agrees to all of buyer's requests, some are buyer's requests, and buyer accepts the seller's partial agreement below, buyer removes the investigation of property contingency. Okay, that's the default. You don't have to check anything. You don't have to change anything. The default is, hey, seller, here is the request for repairs. If you agree to this, either in part or in full, and if it's in part, I agree to you partially agreeing to it, I'm removing my investigation of property contingency. I don't need to submit another contingency removal form. I can't claim that I didn't do it. It's done. Okay. You could say accept the following. So this is might be where you would put like accept insurability of property. Something to that effect if you're having problems getting insurance. So just know that that's on there. If there's something you don't want to remove with regards to the investigation of the property, you need to make sure you note it there. Or 2, buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached signed contingency removal form. That would be the option 2. So default is it removes except, and option 2 is you attach a contingency removal form. You don't need to do that though, unless you're only removing part of it. Buyer releases seller from any loss, liability, expense claims, or cause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property. Okay. So now if we come down here to the seller's response, right? We have the seller's response down here to that repair request. Buyer makes the request. Seller has a chance to respond. Keep in mind the seller doesn't have to respond at all. They have no obligation to respond to a repair request. As a listing agent, I think it's bad etiquette to not respond to the repair requests, and you don't have to. It's reiterating to the seller up here that, hey, like heads up, if you don't do the FHA and VA required repairs, then the buyer probably can't proceed forward. Buyer has the option to agree to all partial additional comments. So additional comments here are seller agreement only apply if buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached contingency removal form. That's only if they check that box. So remember, otherwise we already stated up above that if the seller agrees to all or a partial and the buyer agrees to seller's partial, we're removing that contingency. But the seller can do additional conditions and attach this. Maybe it's time for like the loan and the appraisal. Maybe it's time for all the contingencies to be removed. The sellers could check that box and say, hey, you got to remove everything for us to agree to this. Here's the expiration there. We're not going to worry about that. If the seller responds on the attached RRRR form, which is almost unnecessary now that we have so many options on the regular RR, but I'll show you that in a minute. Buyer's requests are not incorporated into the agreements. You can respond on an AEA instead. Seller does not agree. If the seller does not agree, then the contingencies are not removed. Remember, it only removes them if if they agree to the buyer's repairs request, or if they partially agree and then the buyer down here also agrees. So how this works, I know you're like, this is getting so confusing. Buyer makes the request up here. Buyer makes the request and signs number 6. Seller makes a response here in this section on the seller response. If it's A and the seller agrees to all buyer's requests, we're done with this repair request. Seller has agreed, those repairs or that credit will be done. If there's a partial agreement here, then we have to move down to this bottom section where the buyer has a chance then to respond again. The buyer response and seller partial or conditional agreements. We do not sign this until after the seller responds above. Buyer accepts seller's partial or conditional agreement, or buyer does not accept and submits a new request for repairs. Buyer responds to seller's partial agreement on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of copy by making this buyer response. Any previous buyer response, seller reply, or seller partial agreement can no longer be accepted. Seller signs that, or buyer signs there. Okay. Now remember what it said up here in the top part, the buyer request is buyer removes if seller agrees to buyer's request or some of buyer's requests and buyer accepts seller's partial agreement, buyer removes the investigation of property contingency. Whew. So much included in this form, but a lot of people don't realize they've snuck that one into the request for repairs as the default now. The other option is the seller response. So this is the RRRR form. Seller response and buyer reply to the request for repairs. Here, the seller has all those options they had on the previous one. Again, they can actually agree, partially agree, right? Do all the things. Seller's condition, the seller's agreement only applies if buyer removes the investigation. Contingency is the default. So if the seller replies, doesn't change anything down here, buyer agrees to seller's response, then that investigation contingency has now been removed. Okay, the seller can also say, hey, remove everything except the following, or remove, we're gonna send over a CR with this response with the contingencies removed that we require. Okay. Oh, this would be sorry. Option number 1, the default is it removes the investigation contingency. You can have the option of checking accept. Option number 2 is the buyer removes the contingency identified on the contingency removal form that the buyer gave us as part of their contingency removal. So if they did a separate contingency removal, we would check this box here. Or seller can create their own contingency removal form for the buyer and check it here as option number 3. Okay. So that's how that rolls with the contingency removal forms. Any questions about the FVAC form, the HID form, or the contingency removal situation? Fabulous. I hope you guys found this beneficial and helpful. Does anybody have questions about any other forms that you want to ask while we have time remaining? We have about 8 minutes left. So if you have questions about other forms, I'm happy to pull them up and go over them. And then also you can log your attendance by clicking the link in the chat box. That also gives you the option to make any suggestions for trainings that you would like to see in the future. Any other questions? All right, we will be back tomorrow. Oh, Deborah, go ahead.
Just saying thank you.
You are welcome. We'll be back tomorrow talking about the buyer presentation and the buyer process up until the offer, showing properties, securing buyers, that type of thing. And then remember, no training again on Wednesday at 11 because we should be having the office meeting. We will still have a training. I know it's Valentine's Day, but who cares? We'll still have the training on Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, covering Sky Slope. We've revised the schedule a little bit, so we'll be covering Sky Slope Wednesday at 7 o'clock. If you're doing something fun with your loved one for Valentine's Day, it will be recorded, so you can always catch the recording. All right. Fabulous. Thanks for joining me today, everyone. I really appreciate it. We will see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Amy.
You are welcome, Charles.